Every town has its secrets. Ravenshire was no different. At least, that's what people liked to believe. But the truth lurked in the shadows, in the whispers carried by the wind, in the silence that followed a question no one dared to ask. If you listen closely, the village will start to speak, revealing the things that were meant to stay buried. What I'm about to tell you isn't just a story, it's a truth only those brave enough to look into the darkness will understand. So, the real question is, are you ready? Mary Me had a rhythm to it, a quiet, almost hypnotic pulse that settled into the bones of those who lived there, like a melody hummed by time itself. The hedgerows along the country lanes shifted languidly in the breeze, their leaves whispering secrets only the wind could carry. The ancient stone cottages, hunched like watchful sentinels, bore the weight of years with a kind of weary dignity, their ivy-clad facades appearing to sink ever deeper into the earth with each passing season. Even the trees, their gnarled limbs stretching toward the sky like fingers frozen mid-thought, seemed reluctant to disturb the village's measured stillness. Life here was unhurried, moving with the slow certainty of a candle burning down to its final flicker. Miss Jane Marple had long since come to appreciate that rhythm, that sense of suspended time. Seated in her garden, surrounded by lavender and forget-me-nots, she let her fingers trail over the crisp pages of a folded newspaper in her lap, the warmth of a now empty teacup lingering against her palm. It was one of those rare flawless afternoons when the sky stretched wide and impossibly blue, unspoiled by clouds or the burdens of the world. The kind of day that lulled one into the illusion that nothing terrible could ever happen. And yet, even in a place like this, shadows always lingered in the corners of quiet lives. A faint rustle along the lane drew her attention, not the wind, but something deliberate, measured. She didn't need to look up to know who it was before the voice, carefully composed yet edged with something brittle, reached her. "Jane, you look positively radiant in the sunshine." Lady Eleanor Whitcomb's voice carried the smooth polish of high society, yet Miss Marple detected a tautness beneath its pleasantries, a weariness that no amount of refined poise could conceal. She stood at the garden gate, impeccably dressed in a tailored ensemble that spoke of old money and careful curation. A hat, tilted just so, shielded her eyes, but not enough to hide the weight they carried. Miss Marple rose, brushing stray bits of soil from her skirt. "Eleanor, my dear, what an unexpected delight. It has been years, hasn't it? What brings you to our quiet corner of the world?" Lady Eleanor's smile faltered, only for the briefest second, but Miss Marple, ever attuned to the minutiae of human behavior, did not miss it. Then, with a practiced ease that bespoke years of diplomatic maneuvering, Lady Eleanor stepped through the gate, her expression smoothing into one of casual composure. "Diplomatic fatigue, my dear. Nothing more complicated than that. When one is married to an ambassador, there is never a moment to oneself, the weight of nations you might say." But Miss Marple was already studying her with quiet scrutiny. It wasn't merely fatigue that dulled the brightness in her old friend's eyes. It was something else, something brittle, as if she had been carrying a burden too heavy for too long. "How charming," Miss Marple said mildly, gesturing toward the small wicker table where the remnants of her tea sat. "Come, join me for a moment of peace before the world pulls you back into its tempest." Lady Eleanor settled into the chair with a graceful rustle of fabric, but her gaze, Miss Marple noticed, did not linger on the garden's modest beauty. Instead, her eyes swept across the surroundings with a detachment that suggested she was looking for something or someone. "Quite the contrast to the embassy, wouldn't you say?" she mused, the lightness in her tone not quite masking the undertone of something heavier. "The Whitcomb estate is only a temporary arrangement, of course, but I must admit, there's something almost refreshing about escaping the constant machinations of politics." Miss Marple's keen gaze did not waver. Eleanor was choosing her words with care, too much care. "I can imagine," she said gently. I hear Sir Harold has made quite the impression in the village. How is he adjusting to his new post? Lady Eleanor's lips curved, but the smile did not reach her eyes. Sir Harold is Sir Harold, she said airily. He enjoys the quiet, for now, but as always, there are matters of strategic importance keeping him occupied. Briefings, discussions, plans. I hardly see him these days. Not that I mind, of course. A pause, a barely perceptible tap of her fingers against the porcelain rim of the teacup. I'm staying at the vicarage for the time being. It's quieter, more suitable for my purposes. Miss Marple's brow lifted slightly. And what purpose might that be, Eleanor? Surely you're not hiding from your duties entirely. A light laugh, too light, too forced. Oh, just a bit of simplicity, Jane. A brief escape from the endless parade of obligations. Nothing sinister in that, is there? But Miss Marple had already noticed it, that small fleeting crack in Eleanor's carefully maintained veneer. Something was amiss. The tension in her voice was not the kind that came from mere exhaustion or social fatigue. It was the tension of a woman holding something back, something she wasn't yet ready to say. Then, as if realizing she had lingered too long on the edge of vulnerability, Lady Eleanor shifted in her seat, reaching into her handbag with a touch too much haste. A thin creased letter emerged between her fingers, held with a hesitation that spoke volumes. For a moment she merely stared at it, as though uncertain whether to hand it over or to tuck it away once more. Miss Marple said nothing, simply watching with the patient intensity of one who had long since learned that silence often coaxed forth the most telling confessions. Is that something important, Eleanor? The question was gentle, but it landed like a stone in a still pond. Lady Eleanor's hand tightened slightly around the letter, and for the first time since arriving, her composure wavered. Her gaze flickered, first to the letter, then to Miss Marple, and in that brief hesitation, something unspoken passed between them. A shadow, a whisper of something cold curling at the edges of an otherwise perfect afternoon. A hush had settled over Ashcombe Manor, the kind of quiet that wasn't born of peace, but of something more insidious, something watching. The old estate, framed by skeletal oaks and tangled ivy, had seen too many seasons to be easily impressed by time, yet tonight, it felt as though even its stone walls were listening. Lady Beatrice Willoughby, ever the poised hostess, stood by the fireplace, her gloved fingers tracing the rim of an untouched glass of wine. Her guests, a carefully curated selection of diplomats, scholars, and the sort who thrived on whispers rather than conversation, filled the grand hall with a hum of voices, just loud enough to veil the undercurrent of unease. Eleanor Hawthorne arrived fashionably late, as always, her dark emerald dress flowing like liquid shadow as she stepped across the polished marble floor, her eyes sharp as a dagger's edge. "Beatrice, darling, you do know how to summon the most intriguing company," she murmured, accepting a drink from a passing servant. Beatrice's smile was thin. Intriguing is one word for it. Across the room, Lord Peter Calloway stood with the sort of rigid posture that suggested he was either a man of discipline or one who carried a weight too heavy to bear. He met Eleanor's gaze for only a fraction of a second before turning away. Suspicion, calculation, she recognized the signs all too well. She had seen them before in the courts, in the corridors of power, and most often in those who were about to make a mistake. The chandelier above flickered, just once, just long enough for the room to seem dimmer than it had before, and when the light returned, the air felt heavier, as if something had shifted in the very bones of the manor. Beatrice's fingers tightened around the stem of her glass. "There was a letter," she said suddenly, barely above a whisper, but Eleanor heard it clearly. "It arrived yesterday. No signature, just a warning." Eleanor tilted her head slightly, her interest piqued. A warning about what? Beatrice hesitated, her usual composure fracturing at the edges. That something would happen tonight. That someone in this room. She stopped abruptly, her throat tightening as if the words themselves were a danger. Eleanor's pulse quickened. The night had only just begun, and already the game had started. Somewhere in the depths of Ashcombe Manor, beyond the laughter and polite conversation, beyond the crystal glasses and perfumed air, something was waiting, and Eleanor had no intention of letting it catch her unaware. The Manor's grand ballroom shimmered with the deceptive elegance of power draped in silk and shadow. A sea of well-tailored suits and exquisite gowns flowed through the space, their wearers exchanging practiced smiles and murmured pleasantries, but beneath the polished facade, the air carried an undercurrent of something heavier, something unsaid. Annabel Graves watched from the periphery, her gloved fingers tracing the rim of her untouched champagne glass, her eyes sweeping the room with the same precision as a hunter sizing up its prey. A man's laughter, too rich, too rehearsed, broke through the murmur of conversation. Richard Calloway, a financier with a penchant for secrets, was regaling a group of admirers with a tale that, judging by his own amusement, was more self-indulgence than wit. Annabel's gaze, however, caught on the figure standing just beyond him, Lieutenant Henry Mercer, his posture rigid, his uniform immaculate, his watchful eyes betraying an awareness that seemed at odds with the revelry around him. He wasn't here for the wine, nor for the empty flirtations masquerading as conversation. He was waiting, watching, but for what, or for whom? Before she could follow the thread, a movement at the far end of the room snagged her attention. Lady Catherine Whitmore, ever the poised hostess, was discreetly dabbing a lace handkerchief against her lips, though her face was a shade paler than before. The way she held herself, controlled yet uneasy, spoke of something far more than mere exhaustion. Annabel stepped forward, but a new presence intercepted her path. A man slender, dressed in a suit so precisely pressed that it felt more like armor than fabric. His name came to her mind before he could speak. Nicholas Volkov, the enigmatic Russian delegate, whose words were always measured, deliberate, each syllable concealing more than it revealed. "Miss Graves," he murmured, inclining his head slightly, his voice silk-wrapped steel, enjoying the evening. She allowed a slight smile, knowing well the game being played. "Immensely," she replied, her tone light yet sharpened at the edges. "And you, or do these affairs feel more like obligation than entertainment?" Volkov chuckled, but it was a sound without warmth. "Everything is obligation, in one way or another." His gaze flickered just past her shoulder, where Mercer had shifted his stance ever so slightly, a signal almost imperceptible, except to someone like Annabel, who made it her business to notice. Something was unraveling here, beneath the veneer of civility, and whatever it was, it had already begun. A woman's sharp intake of breath cut through the room's hum. Lady Catherine had vanished, slipping into the corridor beyond the ballroom doors. Annabel set her glass down. The game had begun, and she was already 3 steps in. The crystal chime of Sir Reginald Ashford's glass had barely rung through the grand hall when a piercing scream sliced through the air, raw and choked with terror. Conversations shattered into silence. The poised laughter of high society guests crumbled into uneasy murmurs. Then another scream, sharper, more desperate, ripped through the hush, echoing from the upper floors like a jagged knife through velvet. For a split second, the room teetered on the edge of chaos. A few guests turned towards the grand staircase, their expressions wavering between alarm and the hesitant hope that this was some cruel joke. It was not. Reginald set his glass down with deliberate precision, his knuckles paling as his fingers flexed against the table's polished surface. His voice, though composed, carried a weight that demanded immediate obedience. "Captain Harrington," he commanded, his tone clipped, "secure the estate. No one leaves." The captain, a man whose presence alone could silence a battlefield, was already in motion. His boots struck the marble floor with calculated speed as he signaled to the servants, instructing them to guide the guests toward the drawing room. Whispers rose like smoke, thick with speculation and dread. Eloise Fairchild stood at the periphery, her sharp eyes scanning the guests, cataloguing their shifting expressions, fear, confusion, a calculated sort of interest from a few. It was always in moments like these that true intentions surfaced. Her fingers tightened around the stem of her untouched champagne flute, its cool surface grounding her in the storm of uncertainty. Upstairs, the heavy oak door of the master study stood locked, bolted from the inside. Harrington hesitated only briefly before slamming his shoulder against it. Wood splintered under his force, the crack of the door bursting open, swallowed immediately by the stark horror beyond. Samuel Redgrave, the estate's esteemed host, lay crumpled on the Persian rug, a dark stain seeping through the fabric beneath him. A letter opener, its ornate handle gleaming in the dim lamplight, protruded from his chest, a macabre punctuation to the silent chaos of the room. A cabinet door hung ajar, its contents haphazardly disturbed. A faint whiff of pipe smoke lingered, interwoven with something far more distinct, the coppery tang of blood. From the doorway, Eloise absorbed every detail, her mind assembling the pieces before anyone had spoken. No sign of forced entry, a locked door, a struggle, but not a loud one. The scene had been carefully staged, but by whom? And why? A delicate gasp drew attention to Lady Evelyn, her pale hand clutching the edge of the doorframe as her knees buckled. A nearby footman caught her before she collapsed entirely, her eyes wide, lips forming silent words she could not bring herself to speak. "Get her downstairs," Reginald ordered, his gaze never leaving the lifeless body before him. But Eloise stepped forward before they could close the space. "You're all looking at the wrong thing," she murmured, voice low yet certain. The heads of men more accustomed to issuing orders than listening turned towards her. She pointed toward the desk, where a single drawer remained conspicuously untouched amidst the surrounding disarray. "That," she continued, stepping into the room, "is where the real story begins." The grand hall of Ashford Manor was bathed in the warm glow of chandeliers, the glint of crystal glasses catching the flickering candlelight, as Lord Benedict Ashford raised his glass for a toast. The air was thick with the murmur of polite conversation, the refined laughter of nobility, and the soft strains of the quartet playing in the corner. But just as his lips parted to speak, the night was torn apart by a scream, sharp, raw, and unearthly. The sound cut through the revelry like a jagged knife, sending an electric jolt through the assembled guests. Every movement ceased. Conversations strangled mid-sentence. The music faltered into silence. The echo of that scream still hung in the air when a second cry followed, more frantic, filled with unrestrained terror, drifting down from the upper floors like the wail of a lost soul. It was no accident, no misunderstanding. This was something far worse. Lord Ashford's fingers, which had been poised elegantly around the stem of his glass, tightened involuntarily before he placed it down with deliberate precision. The blood had drained from his face, but his voice, when it came, was cold and measured. "Captain Sterling," he said, barely above a whisper, yet commanding absolute attention, "lock the doors, no one leaves." Captain Elias Sterling, a man of rigid discipline and razor-sharp instincts, moved without hesitation. His sharp eyes scanned the guests, trained to pick up the nuances of fear and guilt. Already, some clutched their drinks too tightly, their knuckles pale, others exchanged nervous glances, their postures suddenly too stiff, too careful. A few looked genuinely confused, but not all. The guests were swiftly gathered and ushered into the drawing-room, their hushed whispers a rising tide of speculation and dread. Eleanor Drake remained apart from the rest, a quiet observer amid the chaos. She wasn't like the others. She did not shrink away from fear. Instead she watched, not just the scene unfolding, but the reactions, the subtle widening of eyes, the darting of glances, the measured steps of those who did not want to be noticed. She had seen it before, this dance of the guilty, people who knew something but dared not speak, and those who knew far more than they should. Above, the The grand staircase loomed like the mouth of an abyss. Captain Sterling ascended, his movements controlled, his fingers resting near the revolver at his hip. At the top, he found the source of the screams, a locked door, the ambassador's private study. Sealed from the inside, a murmur of disbelief rippled through the onlookers below as the implications settled in. "Step back," Sterling ordered, and with a forceful strike of his shoulder, the heavy oak splintered and crashed open. The scent of blood met them first, thick and metallic in the air. There, sprawled in the center of the room, lay Victor Langley. His lifeless body was draped across the rich mahogany floor, his fine silk waistcoat, now ruined by the deep crimson spreading across his chest. The weapon, a letter opener, its hilt still protruding from his heart, gleamed under the dim lamplight. It was a scene designed to horrify, but more than that, it was meant to mislead. The room was a mess, papers strewn haphazardly across the desk, an overturned chair, a glass of whiskey untouched yet perfectly balanced on the edge of the table, and yet, something was wrong. There were no defensive wounds, no shattered glass, no signs of a struggle beyond what had been deliberately arranged. Captain Sterling's jaw tightened. This was no ordinary murder, this was methodical. Behind him, Lord Ashford remained silent, his usually composed features betraying something unreadable. Eleanor stepped forward, her eyes flickering from detail to detail, absorbing the inconsistencies, the too perfect mess, the unnatural stillness of the body, the illusion of chaos where there was only careful precision. Then her gaze landed on the desk, where one drawer, unlike the rest of the room, remained slightly ajar, yet untouched. A slow smile, devoid of warmth, touched her lips. "It's too perfect," she murmured, just loud enough to break the silence. Captain Sterling turned to her, his brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" Eleanor's eyes gleamed with quiet certainty as she stepped further into the room, her fingers brushing the edge of the desk. "This isn't a crime of passion," she said softly, her voice razor-sharp. "It's a statement. The killer wanted us to see this mess, but not what truly matters." The heavy scent of cigar smoke clung to the air of Hawthorne Manor's grand drawing room, mingling with the hushed murmurs of uneasy guests. The heavy velvet drapes, drawn tight against the night, seemed to deepen the tension that had settled over the house like a dense fog. Lord Everett Hawthorne, a man whose presence usually commanded the room, sat stiffly in his chair, fingers drumming against the carved mahogany armrest. Across from him, Inspector Ambrose Devereux adjusted his cuffs with meticulous precision, his sharp gaze dissecting every flicker of movement. "You were seen near the study just before the incident, Lady Eleanor," Devereux said, his voice smooth but edged with steel. The lady in question, draped in a gown of deep sapphire, lifted her chin, her expression a mask of composed detachment. "I take nightly walks through the East Wing, Inspector," she replied evenly, her voice carrying the faintest hint of amusement. "I fail to see how that is of any consequence." Devereux's lips curled into something that was not quite a smile. "In a house thick with secrets, my lady, everything is of consequence." A tense silence followed, broken only by the distant toll of the grandfather clock. Across the room, Henry Blackwood, the late Lord Hawthorne's most trusted adviser, leaned against the fireplace, his face half lit by the flickering embers. "If we are to entertain accusations," he said smoothly, "then surely we must look at the one person who has the most to gain." His gaze slid pointedly toward Edmund Carlyle, Lord Hawthorne's estranged nephew, who had been lingering near the liquor cabinet with feigned nonchalance. Edmund smirked, swirling the brandy in his glass. "Oh, come now, Blackwood," he drawled, "if you're suggesting I had a hand in my dear uncle's demise, you'll have to do better than tired insinuations." But even as he spoke, Eleanor watched the slight twitch of his fingers, the subtle tightness in his jaw, a telltale sign of a man who knew more than he was letting on. Before another word could be exchanged, a commotion from the corridor sent a fresh wave of unease rippling through the gathered guests. The doors swung open, and Captain Julian Sterling strode in, his expression unreadable. In his gloved hand, he held a sealed envelope, its wax seal partially broken. "This was found in Lord Hawthorne's private study," he announced, his voice clipped. "It appears to contain instructions, urgent ones, regarding a shipment scheduled to arrive at dawn." Eleanor's breath caught. A shipment. The word itself carried an air of foreboding, and something in the pit of her stomach twisted with realization. It wasn't just a murder, it was a warning. The shadows cast by the candlelight seemed to lengthen, stretching over the assembled figures like grasping fingers, and Eleanor knew with chilling certainty that the night's events were far from over. The village of Ravenshade had always harbored secrets, but on this particular evening, as the wind howled through the narrow streets and the gas lamps flickered like dying stars, something far darker lurked beneath its genteel facade. At the heart of it all stood the Blackthorn estate, an imposing structure that had seen generations of wealth, betrayal, and whispered sins carried on the wind. Inside, the guests had gathered in the grand hall, their expressions a mixture of unease and veiled curiosity, as Inspector Elias Crowe surveyed them with the precision of a hawk. "Miss Everleigh," he said smoothly, his voice laced with quiet authority, "you were seen leaving the study mere moments before the shot was fired. Would you care to explain?" Eleanor Everleigh, draped in a gown of deep emerald, met his gaze without flinching. "I stepped out for air, Inspector," she replied, her voice measured. The room felt stifling. "Stifling," Crowe echoed, his eyes narrowing slightly. "How convenient." A heavy silence settled over the room, broken only by the slow ticking of the ornate grandfather clock. Across the chamber, Mr. Hawthorne, the host of the evening's ill-fated gathering, stood near the marble fireplace, his fingers gripping the edge of the mantelpiece. He had built his fortune on steel and sweat, yet tonight, he seemed nothing more than a man watching his empire crumble. "We are wasting time," came the sharp voice of Victor St. James, a financier known for his ruthless dealings. "Whoever did this is standing in this room and we all know it." "Do we?" Crowe countered, his tone unreadable. "Or are you merely trying to deflect?" St. James smoked, but his knuckles tightened around the tumbler of scotch in his hand. Before another word could be uttered, a sudden rustling at the far end of the hall drew every gaze. Miss Evangeline Frost, ever the silent observer, had reached into her velvet handbag, her gloved fingers producing a single folded note. "This," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "was slipped into my pocket before the commotion began." Crowe took the note, his sharp gaze scanning the hastily scrawled words. "The shipment arrives at dawn. Fail, and we all fall." A shift in the atmosphere, subtle yet undeniable, crept through the room. This was not just a murder, this was the unraveling of something far larger, a game of power and deception that stretched far beyond the walls of Blackthorn Estate. "Inspector," Hawthorne finally spoke, his voice weary yet firm, "you must understand, there are forces at play here that you do not wish to provoke." Crowe's lips curled into a cold smile. "On the contrary," he murmured, slipping the note into his coat, "I rather think those forces should be very afraid." It was a deep, unsettling night when an air of unease settled over Blackthorn Estate. The pale moonlight filtered through the baroque windows of the old library, casting eerie shadows upon the mahogany bookshelves where the lifeless body of Sir Reginald Fairfax lay. A smouldering cigar was still clenched between his fingers, as if death had caught him mid-thought, altering the course of fate itself. Inspector Alden Crowe, often called the Hound, observed the scene with his sharp steel-grey eyes, his mind already weaving together the scattered threads of the mystery before him. Every corner of the room whispered a story, and Crowe was there to listen, an unfinished cup of coffee, a torn letter, and an antique clock running 2 minutes slow. These were not mere relics of an interrupted evening, they were a veil, carefully placed to obscure the truth. Lady Genevieve Holloway, wrapped in a striking crimson dress, sat nearby with a restlessness that spoke volumes. Sir Reginald, he said he had secrets. Secrets that if revealed, could destroy lives, she murmured, her voice a whisper, as though someone beyond the walls might be listening. Victor St. James swirled his whiskey glass absent-mindedly, a fleeting smirk crossing his lips. Secrets, or just the paranoid ramblings of an aging man who saw shadows where there were none. But his smile never quite reached his eyes, which still carried the weight of unspoken knowledge. Inspector Crow lit a cigarette, the swirling smoke thickening the already oppressive air of the room. His fingers traced the worn spines of the books lining the shelves, pausing on one older and more tattered than the rest. He pulled it free, and a faint crackling sound betrayed the presence of something hidden within. Opening the book, he extracted a yellowed frayed letter bearing a single name. Moriarty. This was no ordinary name, it was a doorway into a concealed world, one that thrived in the darkness and revealed itself only to those who dared to look. Sir Reginald's murder was not the end of a story, it was merely its beginning. Every person in the estate harbored their own secrets, their own silent histories, sealed away until the right moment unraveled them. Inspector Crow glanced at his watch. The time for mere speculation had passed. Now it was time to chase the truth, no matter the cost. Murder was never just an act, it was an emotion buried deep within every soul, waiting for the right moment to surface. The scent of aged parchment and fading cigar smoke wove through the dimly lit study of Whitmore Manor, where time itself seemed to hesitate. The grandfather clock in the corner let out a hollow tick, each second stretching like an unspoken confession. Miss Eleanor Graves moved her fingers lightly over the brass lock of the desk drawer, tracing the faint scratches that marred its surface. The air was thick with anticipation, the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths pressing down upon the room. This wasn't forced, she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. No, whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. The firelight flickered, casting restless shadows along the ornate bookshelves. Across from her, Inspector Lionel Drake stood with an air of restrained tension, his gloved fingers tapping against the silver handle of his cane. His steel-grey eyes, sharp as a predator's, studied Eleanor carefully. "Explain," he commanded, his voice clipped but intrigued. Eleanor turned toward the keyhole, running a careful finger along the edge. "A thin wire," she said, almost to herself, slipped through the gap in the door, nudging the key from the other side. No need for force, no need for noise, just precision. She looked up at Drake. A clean trick, deceptively simple but requiring knowledge and skill. Drake's brow furrowed as the implications settled in. If they had access to the key, why not use it properly? Eleanor allowed a small knowing smile to curve her lips. "Because the illusion mattered more than the act itself," she replied. "A locked room mystery. If the key had turned cleanly in the lock, someone would have questioned it. But this makes it seem as though no one could have entered from the outside. A deliberate deception, a false puzzle, a crime hidden behind the illusion of impossibility." A rustle at the doorway made them both turn sharply. Lady Vivienne Lockwood stood there, barely a shadow in the dim glow of the study lamps. The silk of her midnight blue gown pulled around her feet, her gloved hands twisting together as though holding back something fragile, perhaps her own resolve. She had been standing there long enough to listen, long enough to absorb every word like a poison slipping through her veins. "You're certain?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her gaze flickered to the half-open drawer, the one Eleanor had so carefully examined. "About what you found?" Eleanor met her gaze, her eyes unwavering. "This isn't just about a murder, Lady Lockwood," she said softly. "It's about something far bigger. Your husband's involvement, Mr. Blackwell's silence. This was never just a betrayal, it was a game no one was meant to see." Vivienne's lips trembled, her breath coming in shallow bursts. The fire crackled behind them, a reminder of the room's once warmth, now long gone. I don't understand," she whispered, though the way her hands clenched at her sides betrayed her. Eleanor tilted her head slightly. the movement as sharp as the dagger concealed within her words. "You do," she murmured. "You just don't want to admit it." The silence stretched thick and suffocating. The weight of unsaid truths loomed between them, a shadow that could no longer be ignored. Blackwell was about to expose something, Eleanor continued, her voice cool, calculated, and someone couldn't afford to let that happen. Lady Lockwood swayed slightly, her complexion pale as the moonlight filtering through the heavy velvet curtains. She opened her mouth once, then closed it, as if swallowing something bitter. He was going to leave, she finally whispered. He was going to take everything, the documents, the records. He was going to bring it all crashing down. Drake inhaled sharply, his keen mind already racing through the implications, and someone stopped him before he could. Eleanor's gaze never left Lady Lockwood's face. "And you," she said gently but firmly, "knew more than you let on." The flames in the fireplace crackled, casting flickering shadows across the high walls, dancing like ghosts over the mahogany paneling. The study, once a place of contemplation and diplomacy, had become a battlefield of whispered conspiracies and half-truths. Sir Alistair Whitmore sat rigid behind his desk, his fingers drumming a slow, methodical rhythm against the polished wood. His hands, large, elegant, but undeniably restless, revealed more than his carefully composed expression ever could. A man's true nature, Eleanor had always believed, was revealed in his hands, and Sir Alistair's hands told a story of anxiety, of desperation, of a man who had already lost control of the game. "Blackwell," Sir Alistair finally said, his voice heavy, each word dragging under the weight of suppressed truths, "was never just a diplomat." He exhaled slowly, rubbing his temple as though fighting off a headache. "And this was never just about money." His voice dropped lower, almost inaudible. "This was about power, about the kind of secrets that don't just ruin lives, they end them." The fire crackled again, louder this time, as though the room itself acknowledged the dark turn the night had taken, and in that moment, Eleanor Graves knew, this was not the end of the mystery, it was only the beginning. The heavy scent of wax-polished wood and aging ink filled the dimly lit chamber, where the fire's restless glow barely touched the shadows gathering in the corners. Sir Reginald Ashbourne sat motionless behind the grand oak desk, his fingers drumming a slow, calculated rhythm against the wood. The study, once a sanctuary of secrets, now held the weight of a conspiracy that had unraveled far beyond its intended boundaries. Across from him, Miss Evelyn Harrow stood with an air of quiet authority, her sharp eyes missing nothing. The silence between them was taut, stretched thin by unspoken truths. "Blackwell played a dangerous game," she murmured, her voice as smooth as the velvet drapes framing the tall windows. "But he wasn't the only one." Her gaze flickered toward the door, where Lady Rosalind Fairchild stood just inside the threshold, a ghost of hesitation haunting her delicate features. Reginald exhaled slowly, his grip tightening around the letter opener that rested on his desk. "You assume too much, Miss Harrow," he said, his voice even yet laced with something darker beneath the surface. Blackwell thought he could leverage information for his own benefit, thought he could control the board. He leaned forward slightly, his shadow stretching across the polished floor, but he was mistaken. This wasn't a game where he held all the pieces. Lady Rosalind's breath hitched, her gloved hands tightening around the folds of her gown. "You knew," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You knew what he was planning." Miss Harrow inclined her head, her expression unreadable. "Not just knew," she corrected, "anticipated, prepared for." She stepped closer to the desk, her boots clicking softly against the floor. Blackwell was careless. He thought secrets were weapons, but he underestimated the weight of the hands that held them. Her fingers grazed the edge of a small locked drawer in the desk, the metal cold beneath her touch. He thought power was in knowledge. She looked up, meeting Sir Reginald's steely gaze, but true power lies in knowing when to act. Reginald's lips curled into the faintest trace of a smile, but there was no amusement in it. "And what do you believe, Miss Harrow?" he asked, his voice deceptively soft. "That truth should be left to fester in the dark, or that it should be dragged into the light, consequences be damned." A silence stretched between them, weighted and unrelenting. Outside, the wind howled through the ancient halls of Ashbourne Manor, rattling against the leaded glass windows, as though the very house itself protested the words left unspoken. Lady Rosalind took an uneasy step forward, her pulse quickening. "Reginald," she said, her voice tight with something close to desperation, "tell me the truth. Tell me you didn't." But the words died in her throat as the door behind them creaked open, and Colonel James Hawthorne stepped inside, his boots heavy against the polished wood. His expression was grim, the lines of his face carved by the weight of too many burdens. "There's no point in denial," he said quietly, his gaze locking onto Reginald's. "We all know why Blackwell was silenced, and we all know who ensured it." Miss Harrow tilted her head, studying the Colonel with the same measured patience she reserved for a chessboard mid-play. "And you, Colonel," she murmured, "were you the executioner, or simply another pawn in the game?" A muscle in Hawthorne's jaw tightened. "I did what was necessary," he said, his voice low. "For the country, for all of us." The fire crackled in the hearth, its embers spitting as though in protest to the confession that hung in the air. Miss Harrow let the silence settle before speaking again, her voice a whisper against the storm brewing beyond the manor's walls. "Then I suppose the real question is, who decided necessity was worth a life?" Reginald folded his hands over the desk, his expression unreadable. "It was never about worth," he said. "It was about inevitability." Lady Rosalind let out a slow, trembling breath. "Then we're all complicit," she whispered. Miss Harrow's lips parted, as if to respond, but before she could, the clock on the mantelpiece let out a single chime, the hollow sound reverberating through the chamber like a verdict passed down from the shadows themselves. The clock in Ravenshire Manor struck 9, its deep chime reverberating through the dimly lit corridors, each toll sending a shiver through the cold stone walls. Outside, the storm raged, wind howling through the barren trees, rain lashing against the high-arched windows. Detective Eleanor Graves stood motionless in the grand drawing-room, her silhouette sharp against the flickering candlelight. She traced the rim of a porcelain teacup, left abandoned on the mahogany table, delicate, floral-scented and yet tainted with something metallic. She brought the cup closer to her nose. Blood, faint but undeniable. Someone had tried to hide it, but no crime, no matter how carefully orchestrated, was ever perfect. Across the room Lord Sebastian Whitmore adjusted his cravat with an air of forced composure, but his fingers betrayed him, trembling as they grazed the embroidered silk. Beside him, Lady Rosalind sat rigidly, her fingers curling around the armrest of her chair as if anchoring herself. The air between them was thick with something unsaid, something festering beneath the surface like rot beneath polished wood. Graves took in every detail, the slight twitch in Lord Whitmore's jaw when she shifted her gaze to him, the way Lady Rosalind stole glances toward the heavy velvet drapes, her breath shallow, uneasy. A log in the fireplace cracked suddenly, sending a brief spray of embers into the dimly lit room. Whitmore flinched. Graves smiled, a small victory. "You were supposed to handle this, Sebastian," Rosalind finally whispered, her voice like silk wrapped around steel. There was no affection in the way she said his name, only disappointment, maybe even contempt. "And yet, here we are." Graves tapped her cane against the floor. "A man is dead," she said, her voice quiet but unwavering. "Mr. Alistair Blackwood, was it?" At the mention of the name, Whitmore's fingers twitched, Rosalind's lips parted, just slightly. Graves took in every reaction, cataloguing them like pieces of an unfinished puzzle. She took a slow step forward. Beneath her boot, the edge of the Persian rug lifted slightly, revealing something dark against the polished floor, a stain. Someone had tried to clean it, but some stains never truly disappeared, just like secrets. The air in the manor felt heavier now, thick with the weight of too many hidden truths, but there was more. The half-burned letter in the fireplace, the indentations on the windowsill, as though someone had climbed in or out. A distant howl cut through the night, long and mournful. Outside, the storm was reaching its peak, lightning illuminating the vast gardens for a fraction of a second before plunging the estate back into darkness. Then the parlor doors creaked open. A figure stepped inside, his boots clicking against the marble floor. Captain Julian Hawthorne. He removed his hat, shaking off the rain, but his sharp grey eyes were unwavering, cutting through the tension in the room. "Inspector Graves," he greeted, his voice clipped, professional. "There are things at play here that you do not understand." Graves exhaled slowly, tilting her head just so. "I understand enough," she murmured, running a gloved hand along the edge of the mahogany table. "Enough to know that every person in this room had something to lose should Blackwood have spoken." For the briefest of moments Hawthorne's expression shifted, a flicker of something, regret perhaps. It was gone as quickly as it had appeared. Whitmore scoffed, forcing a laugh that fell flat in the heavy silence. "Blackwood was a fool," he said too quickly. "A man like that always meets an unfortunate end." Graves turned her gaze to him. "A fool or a threat?" Silence. The storm outside grew louder. The wind rattled the windows, as if demanding entrance, demanding that the truth be set free. Rosalind swallowed, hard. Hawthorne stepped further into the room. There was something in his stance, something Graves recognized. A man caught between duty and morality, between truth and the weight of the consequences it carried. "Better a dead traitor," Hawthorne said at last, his voice low, "than secrets in the wrong hands." For the first time that evening Graves allowed herself to smile, because now she had them exactly where she wanted them. This wasn't just a case of murder, this was something far more dangerous. And Eleanor Graves had every intention of uncovering the truth, no matter what it cost. The vicarage had always been a place of solace, a refuge from the world's unrelenting chaos, but tonight it felt like a carefully laid trap, its walls pressing inward with the weight of unspoken secrets. The rain lashed against the high windows, the wind howling through the empty corridors like a spectre, whispering warnings of what was to come. Miss Marple, her gloved hands tightening around the folds of her coat, stepped forward with unwavering resolve. Confronting Lady Elena was not a task she relished, but it was necessary. The pieces were aligned, the game had begun, and the final move depended on the truth, buried within the trembling woman standing before her. Lady Elena's pale face, illuminated by the flickering glow of the candelabra, betrayed the cracks in her carefully composed mask, the shadows beneath her eyes, the faint tremor in her fingers as she gestured for Miss Marple to enter, spoke of sleepless nights haunted by the spectre of guilt. "You're not disturbing me at all," she murmured, though the strain in her voice told a different story. The parlor was warm, but an icy tension lingered between them as Miss Marple lowered herself onto the velvet chaise, her gaze lingering on the woman who had spent years perfecting the art of deception. "It's about Blackwell," she said, her voice steady, her words weighted with implication. "We both know the story is far from simple. Your husband's involvement, this is more than just a murder, isn't it?" For a brief moment, Lady Elena's expression faltered, her carefully constructed facade splintering under the weight of those words. "I don't understand what you're suggesting," she whispered, but the way her fingers clenched the delicate china teacup betrayed the truth. Miss Marple leaned forward, the firelight casting sharp shadows across her face. "You knew Blackwell, you were involved with him, but not by choice. He held power over you, didn't he, Lady Elena?" A gasp, barely audible, the porcelain cup trembled in her hands. "I didn't want any of this," she admitted, voice cracking. "He threatened us, Miss Marple. He had letters that could have destroyed everything." Miss Marple's keen eyes watched the way her shoulders tensed, the way she struggled against the tide of her own conscience. "Letters that could ruin your husband's career," she said, voice softer now, yet no less piercing. That's why you helped him. But it wasn't loyalty, was it? It was fear. Lady Elena's breath hitched, her hands tightening into fists as if she could physically grasp the past and rewrite it. I had no choice, she whispered, tears brimming at the corners of her eyes. He was going to sell them to the highest bidder. He was going to ruin us. I couldn't let that happen. Miss Marple studied her, watching the fine balance between remorse and justification play across her face. And when you realized he wouldn't stop, you did what you had to do, she pressed, her voice a thread of steel. Lady Elena let out a shuddering breath, her gaze falling to the floor. I never thought it would come to this, she admitted. I never thought it would end like this. Silence stretched between them, thick with the weight of unspoken truths. The storm outside raged on, the wind rattling the windows like a caged animal desperate for release. Miss Marple rose, placing a hand on the woman's trembling shoulder. The trouble with men like Blackwell is that they never leave you with many options. But there's still time, Lady Elena. If you help me understand what happened that night, we might be able to stop this before it goes any further. Lady Elena looked up, torn between fear and the realization that she was already ensnared in the inevitable. What do you want from me? She whispered. Miss Marple's voice was calm but unyielding. The truth, everything. What happened that night? Where were you? Lady Elena hesitated, her breath shallow. I was near the study, she confessed at last. I wasn't meant to be there, but I heard him packing. He was leaving, he was going to take everything with him. I couldn't let him. Her voice cracked, and for a moment, she was lost in the memory of that fateful night. Miss Marple remained silent, letting the truth unravel at its own pace. The picture was beginning to take shape, the threads of deception slowly weaving together into a tapestry of betrayal and desperation. But there was still more, there was always more. And as she left the vicarage, stepping out into the relentless storm, she knew one thing for certain: Lady Elena was desperate, but someone else, someone far more dangerous, was pulling the strings. The Witham estate loomed in the distance, its dark silhouette against the storm-lit sky, a foreboding reminder that the real danger was yet to come. The air was thick with the lingering scent of blood and intrigue, a silent testament to the chaos festering beneath its polished surface. The murder had been precise, calculated, but the deeper Miss Marple dug, the more she sensed the raw, chaotic fear that lay beneath. And as she approached the grand doors, where Inspector Duval stood waiting, she knew that the next move in this deadly game would bring her face to face with the unseen force lurking in the shadows. The truth was within reach, but it was buried in darkness, waiting to be unearthed. The study was suffocating with the weight of silence, its once grand furnishings now a crime scene veiled in deception. Miss Marple stepped inside, her sharp gaze scanning the room like a predator circling its prey. The air carried the faint scent of old books and something darker, fear perhaps, or the lingering remnants of a desperate act. Inspector Duval stood rigid by the window, arms crossed, his patience thinning with every passing second. "You've already combed through this, haven't you?" Miss Marple asked, her voice calm but edged with something unreadable. "Of course," Duval responded tersely. "Nothing but the obvious. Locked door, body staged, no forced entry. A textbook locked room mystery. Or a very deliberate illusion," Miss Marple murmured, kneeling by the door. Her fingers traced the minute scratches around the keyhole, faint but telling, a thin wire. Used to slide the key from the lock, retrieve it, then relock the door from outside. Not locked at all, merely made to seem so. Duval stiffened, his skepticism flickering. "A deception, not just any deception," she said, rising. "A deception designed to mislead, to push us toward the simplest conclusion while the real truth festers beneath." She turned toward the desk, noting the scattered papers, the overturned chair, chaos, but too symmetrical, too calculated. As her hand brushed against the wooden floor, she felt it, a faint give, a barely perceptible shift beneath her touch. Without hesitation, she pried the loose board free. A compartment lay beneath, dark and undisturbed, as though holding its breath. Reaching inside, her fingers closed around something cold, metallic. She pulled it into the light, a revolver, its barrel gleaming ominously. Duval stepped forward, his eyes narrowing, wiped clean, no prints. "And registered to someone unexpected," Miss Marple replied, turning the weapon to reveal the serial number. "Captain Herrick," the inspector exhaled sharply. "Herrick? That makes no sense." "On the contrary, it makes too much sense," she murmured, her mind racing. But it was not the gun that intrigued her most. It was the stack of folded documents hidden alongside it. Carefully, she unfolded one, her eyes scanning the symbols, the careful encryptions. "These," she said, holding them up, "are ciphers, diplomatic codes." Duval's expression darkened. Blackwell was a journalist. Why would he have these? "Because he wasn't just a journalist," Miss Marple answered, her voice low, deliberate. "He was a broker of secrets. Someone who knew too much, someone who was silenced before he could sell what he had." She rifled through the pages, pausing on one particular sheet marked with initials. "And Herrick. He didn't kill Blackwell. He was trying to prevent the sale, trying to stop the real orchestrator of this game." Duval stared at her, the pieces shifting in his mind like a puzzle, finally beginning to take shape. "Then who?" She turned to him, the weight of realization settling in her gaze. "Someone with far more to lose than a mere soldier. Someone who needs this to remain buried." The walls of the study, once merely a backdrop to an elaborate ruse, now seemed to whisper their own secrets. Somewhere beyond them, the real killer was watching, waiting. The game was not just one of murder, but of power, of influence, of a truth far more dangerous than death. The air inside the dimly lit study was thick with tension, the weight of unsaid words pressing against the silence. Miss Marple sat poised in the high-backed chair, her fingers steepled as she studied the man before her, Colonel Everett Stane, a man whose face bore the hardened lines of discipline, yet whose eyes betrayed a secret struggle. Across from him, Inspector Duval watched with his usual skepticism, the unease in his stance suggesting he sensed they were circling something far darker than they had anticipated. Between them, placed deliberately on the heavy oak desk, lay a single item, the revolver Miss Marple had unearthed from the hidden compartment, its barrel polished to an unnatural gleam. "Let's not waste time," she said, evenly, her voice carrying the weight of quiet certainty. "You tampered with the crime scene, Colonel. But I don't believe you killed Blackwell." Stane exhaled slowly, his expression unreadable. "I secured sensitive documents. That's all." "No," Miss Marple corrected, leaning forward slightly. "You erased something, something crucial, not just documents, but evidence that would tell us why Blackwell was killed." Duval's grip on the revolver tightened. "If you knew a murder was about to take place, why didn't you stop it?" Stane's jaw flexed. "Because I didn't know, not until it was too late." The answer was smooth, but there was something forced in his delivery, something that sent a sharp thrill of recognition through Miss Marple. He was lying. Blackwell wasn't just a journalist, she continued, her gaze unwavering. He was a conduit, wasn't he? Trading secrets that could collapse more than just reputations. Stane remained silent, but a muscle ticked in his temple. Miss Marple's voice softened, but the steel remained beneath. "And yet, this wasn't just political, it was personal." The silence in the room shifted, like a breath held too long. Then at last, Stane spoke. Blackwell was going to expose an affair, he admitted, his voice rough. A connection that would have, ruined someone close, someone powerful. A pause, then softly, someone who would do anything to keep it buried. Duval inhaled sharply. "Who?" Stane hesitated, then finally lifted his gaze, something haunted flickering in his eyes. Eleanor Whitmore, the name landed like a gunshot in the small room. Miss Marple didn't move, didn't blink, but inside, something clicked into place. Eleanor Whitmore, the widow of a once prominent diplomat, a woman whose influence stretched through corridors of power like invisible threads. She had been at Blackwell's last gathering. She had spoken to him that night, and now she was the missing piece. Duval recovered first. "You're saying she ordered Blackwell's murder?" "No." Staines' voice was grim. "I'm saying she made a single desperate request to make the information disappear, and someone took that request and turned it into something else entirely." Miss Marple exhaled slowly, piecing it together. "Blackwell's death wasn't just about secrets," she murmured. "It was about protection, about eliminating a threat before it could speak." She stood, the atmosphere in the room shifting with her. This was never a simple locked room mystery, it was a message, a warning. Staines' eyes darkened. "And now that you know." Miss Marple's lips curved in a smile that held no warmth. "Now, Colonel, we see just how far someone is willing to go to keep their sins buried." There was a restlessness in the moonlit night of Anderson Manor, a silence that only exists when a secret is on the verge of being unraveled. Shadows clung to the old stone walls, stretching long like remnants of an untold story, as if every corner of the grand estate was desperately trying to conceal an unspoken truth. Inspector Eleanor Wren glanced at the clock. Each passing second hummed in her mind, like time itself was a witness to the events unfolding. The chandelier overhead swayed slightly, its golden glow flickering as though burdened by the weight of an unseen gaze. Across from her, Colonel Edgar Stane tapped his fingers against the wooden table, his piercing gaze locked onto Eleanor, as though awaiting a verdict. "This was not just a murder," Eleanor said, her voice low but firm. "This was a move in a game only someone truly willing to sacrifice lives could have played." A faint smile curled at the corner of Staines' lips, but his eyes still held that sharp gleam, one that could either be the glint of a hidden victory or the remnants of a carefully laid deception. "And you believe I know something about it?" he murmured, his tone smooth, as if he already knew that Eleanor had pieced the truth together. Eleanor exhaled slowly and placed the corner of an aged letter on the table, an artifact of the past that had, until now, remained shrouded in darkness. Its words were brief yet heavy, penned by a man who had known the truth but never lived long enough to speak it aloud. Staines' hand hesitated, a fleeting moment where his carefully crafted mask almost slipped. "Everyone fears something, Eleanor," he said quietly, "but sometimes the greatest threat is the one we see in our own reflection." A cold silence settled between them, thick and unforgiving. Outside, the toll of a distant bell echoed through the night, the wind carrying with it the whisper of an old secret stirring from its grave. Eleanor's heartbeat quickened, yet her expression remained unreadable. Her mind raced through every piece of the puzzle, every fragment of this murder that had led her to this moment. This wasn't just about espionage or political intrigue, it was something far more personal, a revenge buried so deep that no one had seen it coming. "So you're telling me," Staines' voice was measured, but there was the faintest edge of unease, "that Blackwell was killed for personal reasons?" "Absolutely," Eleanor replied. "He wasn't just a pawn in a political chess game. His death served more than just a mission, it fulfilled someone's personal agenda, and I only need one confirmation." She placed another paper on the table, a piece of evidence only one person could recognize. Staines' face darkened for the briefest second, before his expression returned to its usual impassive mask. But Eleanor had seen it. The game's real player had finally stepped into the light. The storm hadn't arrived yet, but its beginning was inevitable. The soft glow of the dimly lit parlor cast elongated shadows across the grand fireplace, where the embers burned low, as if reluctant to let the night slip into oblivion. The village had always prided itself on its quiet charm, but tonight, silence was a thing of deception, false, misleading. a veil draped over something far more insidious. Outside, the wind carried a whisper through the trees, rustling the ivy along the manor's stalls, as if the very earth conspired to reveal secrets buried beneath its surface. Inspector Eleanor Wren swirled the tea in her porcelain cup, the rhythmic motion as deliberate as her thoughts. Across from her, Vincent Reddington reclined into his chair, his hands steepled, his expression one of polite indifference, though Eleanor knew better. The faintest trace of tension lay beneath his carefully crafted demeanor, a subtle tightness around the mouth, a measured stillness in his fingers. He was a man used to control, to operating in shadows, but tonight, those shadows were shifting. "It's a remarkable thing, isn't it?" Eleanor mused, her tone featherlight yet cutting, her eyes fixed on him with unwavering precision. How a place can feel so peaceful, even when buried beneath whispers it dares not acknowledge. Reddington smiled, an effortless curve of the lips, yet there was no warmth behind it. "You speak in riddles, Inspector," he said smoothly, his voice the practiced cadence of a man who had spent years maneuvering through conversations like a fencer with a blade. "If you're referring to the unfortunate demise of Mr. Graves, I fear you're assigning more weight to the matter than it deserves." Eleanor let the silence stretch between them, watching, measuring. The crackle of the fire punctuated the stillness, its glow casting flickering patterns along the mahogany bookshelves lining the room. "Unfortunate, yes," she finally said, voice as calm as ever, but hardly without design. She leaned forward slightly, just enough to tilt the balance of power in the space between them. "You see, Mr. Reddington, I've been thinking about the details, the ones that don't quite add up." The flicker of a reaction, a momentary stillness, the subtlest tightening of his grip, told her everything. A lesser observer might have missed it, but Eleanor was not a lesser observer. "Details," he echoed, his voice carefully neutral, though there was the faintest shift in his posture, like a man bracing for impact. "Yes," Eleanor said smoothly, setting down her cup with measured precision, the clink of porcelain against wood almost deafening in the otherwise hushed room. "The things people say, and more importantly, the things they don't." Her gaze sharpened, pinning him in place. "For instance, you mentioned Graves was found at his desk, slumped forward." She let the statement hang in the air, watching, waiting, a detail never made public. A breath of hesitation, a flick of the eyes toward the fire, small, but telling. "You're grasping at shadows, Inspector," Reddington said, his voice a degree cooler, the careful mask slipping back into place. Eleanor merely smiled, that knowing razor-sharp smile that had unraveled so many before. "No, Mr. Reddington," she said softly, savoring the shift in the air, "I'm unraveling them." The temperature in the room seemed to drop as the weight of unspoken truths pressed down between them. Outside, the distant chime of the grandfather clock in the hallway marked the passage of time, each second stretching the tension between them to its breaking point. "You didn't kill Graves yourself," she continued, her voice a blade slicing through the falsehoods, "but you ensured it happened, didn't you?" A quiet hand in the dark, a whisper to the right ear. Reddington's expression remained unchanged, but Eleanor caught the flicker in his eyes, the silent calculation of a man weighing his next move. The game was shifting, the board tilting ever so slightly in her favor. "Graves had something on you," she pressed, her voice low, steady, "something damning enough that you couldn't afford to let him walk away." A pause, a breath. Then a slow, deliberate exhale. "You think you understand everything," Reddington murmured, voice smooth yet edged with something deeper. "But you don't." Eleanor tilted her head, her gaze unwavering. "Then enlighten me." A pause stretched long between them, thick with a tension that was almost tangible, and then Reddington chuckled, low, dark, knowing. "Power, Inspector," he said at last. "It's never about the truth." Eleanor's smile was slow, razor-sharp. "No," she said, "but sometimes it's the truth that ends it." Reddington said nothing, but the way his fingers curled ever so slightly against the armrest told her everything she needed to know. The rain hammered against the windows of the Black Swan, drowning the hushed murmurs of the few patrons lingering in the dimly lit tavern. The scent of damp wood and aged brandy clung to the air, thick and suffocating. At the farthest corner, where the candlelight barely reached, Evelyn Carrington sat motionless, her untouched glass of scotch reflecting the flickering glow. She had been waiting for over an hour, her patience an icy thing, sharpened by knowledge no one else possessed. Across from her, Lionel Graves fidgeted, his usual air of superiority fraying at the edges. His fingers trembled as he reached for his drink, the faintest sign of a man whose control was slipping. Evelyn let the silence stretch between them, watching the beads of sweat form at his temple, the weight of inevitability pressing down on him. The game was over, he just hadn't accepted it yet. Outside, the village had been eerily still all afternoon, the usual hum of whispered secrets silenced beneath the steady patter of rain, as though the town itself was holding its breath for what was about to unfold. At the entrance, the heavy oak door groaned open, sending a gust of cold air rippling through the room. Every eye flickered toward the newcomer, Delphine Marceau, gliding in like a shadow stretching beneath a dying lantern. She was not a woman who demanded attention, and yet she commanded it effortlessly. No extravagant displays, no unnecessary theatrics, just the quiet, lethal certainty of someone who had pulled the strings for so long. Even the puppets had forgotten they were being controlled. Her movements were fluid, precise, each step a measured calculation. She crossed the room without hesitation, her gaze sweeping over Graves with a flicker of amusement, as if she had already anticipated every desperate move he might consider. Evelyn remained still, her grip tightening around her glass as Delphine reached their table, her presence slicing through the thick tension like a scalpel against fragile skin. "Miss Carrington," Delphine's voice was a whisper of silk over steel, "I was wondering when you'd finally stop watching from the shadows." Graves stiffened, his fingers curling into the table's worn edges. "You were involved from the start," he muttered, his voice laced with reluctant realization. "Playing both sides, I should have seen it." A slow, knowing smile curled at Delphine's lips, the kind that never quite reached her eyes. "You should have, but you didn't," she murmured. "You were too busy believing you were in control." Graves' breath hitched. He had spent years manipulating, orchestrating, ensuring every piece on the board moved according to his design. But now, he was the one trapped, a cornered king with no more pawns to sacrifice. "You used me," he accused, his voice barely more than a whisper. "You played us all." Delphine tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "No, Lionel," she corrected softly, leaning in just enough for her words to settle like ice against his skin. "I dismantled you." The finality in her voice sent a shudder through him, a man staring into the abyss of his own ruin. Evelyn exhaled slowly, watching the realization dawn in his eyes, the stark comprehension that there were no more moves left to play. Outside, the rain fell harder, relentless and unforgiving, drowning out the sound of a world collapsing around him. The storm outside raged like a beast unchained, wind howling against the ancient walls of the Red Fox Inn, its wooden beams creaking under the weight of time and tempest. Inside, the air was thick, heavy with the scent of damp wool and burning tobacco, a room suffocated by unspoken words. Seated at the far end of the tavern, beneath the dim flicker of a gas lantern, Amelia Cavendish sat in silence, her fingers idly tracing the rim of a wine glass long since emptied. Across from her, Victor Langley shifted in his chair, the usual arrogance in his posture now tempered with something else, something brittle. His hands, normally steady as steel, trembled ever so slightly as he lifted his drink, the faintest betrayal of a man who had come to understand that the end of the game was upon him. Amelia had been waiting for this moment, had felt it building in the quiet corners of each whispered conversation, in the missing glances and unfinished sentences that left ghosts in their wake. And now there was nowhere left for Victor to run. The door swung open with a groan, and in stepped Catherine Duvalier, moving with the slow, deliberate grace of a woman who had spent a lifetime pulling strings from the shadows. She was not a woman who announced her presence with grandeur, nor did she need to. Power clung to her like a second skin, her every step a silent declaration of control. Her coat, dark as midnight, dripped from the rain, yet she seemed unaffected, untouched by the storm that had left others shivering in their seats. Her gaze, sharp as a scalpel, swept the room before settling on Victor, the ghost of a smirk playing at her lips. Emilia did not move, did not speak. She simply watched, knowing that the final act was about to begin. "You always did underestimate me, Victor," Catherine murmured, her voice smooth as silk yet sharp enough to draw blood. She slid into the seat beside Emilia with a quiet confidence, her presence sending an unspoken ripple through the tension-choked air. Victor inhaled sharply, his jaw tightening as though bracing for impact. "I should have known," he said, though his voice lacked the conviction it once held. "You were playing both sides from the start." Catherine's smirk widened, though there was no warmth in it. "Playing?" she echoed. "No, Victor, I was orchestrating." Victor leaned forward, his hands gripping the edges of the table as though grounding himself. "You used me," he hissed, his voice low, raw. "You used all of us." Catherine exhaled a soft laugh, shaking her head. "And yet you still believed you were the one in control." Outside, the wind howled louder, rattling the window panes as if the storm itself had come to bear witness. The room seemed to shrink around them, the weight of unspoken truths pressing in from all sides. Emilia remained still, letting the pieces fall into place, watching as Victor came to terms with the reality of his undoing. Then the final piece arrived. The door opened once more, this time with the decisive certainty of a man who had already made up his mind. Inspector Alden Harlow stepped inside, his coat dripping, his gaze sweeping over the gathered players with the weariness of a man who had seen too much. He did not hesitate. His eyes found Victor first, then Catherine. "I trust the conversation has been enlightening," he said, voice measured, deliberate. Victor swallowed hard, his world collapsing in on itself. Catherine, however, merely offered a slow, knowing nod. "Oh, Inspector," she said, her tone laced with something dangerously close to amusement. "It always is." Dark mahogany-paneled walls absorbed the dim glow of the chandelier, casting elongated shadows across the grand study of the Langston Manor. Outside, rain lashed against the stained glass windows, a storm brewing as if nature itself conspired with the treachery within. Inspector Alistair Hawthorne stood near the unlit fireplace, his piercing gaze sweeping the gathered figures, each one a pawn in this perilous game of deception, ambition, and betrayal. Across the room, Emilia Langston, the widow draped in midnight silk, clutched a delicate lace handkerchief, though her expression bore no sign of grief. To her left, Victor Remington, the ever-composed financier, adjusted his cufflinks, his demeanor betraying only the faintest flicker of tension. And then there was Charles Whittaker, his fingers drumming against his whiskey glass, a twitch in his jaw revealing the weight of an unspoken burden. "We all know why we're here." Hawthorne's voice was a measured blade, slicing through the charged silence. "Jonathan Langston wasn't merely killed, he was silenced. And each of you had a reason to want him dead." His words sent ripples through the room. Emilia's grip on her handkerchief tightened. Remington's gaze flickered toward the heavy oak desk. Whittaker exhaled slowly, his throat bobbing as he downed the rest of his whiskey. The inspector took measured steps forward. Jonathan Langston had uncovered something, hadn't he? He paused near the desk, fingers grazing the scattered papers, something damning, and he intended to expose it. A flicker of recognition crossed Emilia's otherwise poised face. "That's absurd," she murmured, though her voice lacked conviction. "Is it?" Hawthorne countered smoothly. He found out about the ledger, the offshore accounts, the funds siphoned from his own company, the betrayal from within. His eyes locked onto Remington. "You orchestrated it, didn't you? The embezzlement, the deception, You knew Jonathan was close to unraveling your scheme. Remington's jaw clenched. I won't stand here and listen to baseless accusations. No, you won't need to, Hawthorne said, because the truth has already spoken for itself. He reached into his coat, producing a small folded paper. Jonathan Langston wrote a letter, a confession of what he had discovered. A name, Mr. Remington. The financier's fingers twitched, but he remained silent. Except, Hawthorne's gaze shifted now. He never got the chance to send it. Did he, Amelia? The room tensed. Amelia's lips parted slightly, as if to deny, but no words came. The servant heard you that night, Hawthorne continued, his tone growing sharper. The argument, the raised voices, the sound of a struggle, and then silence. A slow exhale from Whittaker. The weight of inevitability settled like dust. But it wasn't you, was it? Hawthorne turned suddenly. No, you weren't the one who delivered the fatal blow. He stepped toward Whittaker, whose hand had begun to tremble ever so slightly around his empty glass. You tried to cover for her, didn't you? Your loyalty blinded you. Whittaker's breath hitched. She told me he was going to ruin everything, he whispered, that he would destroy us all. Amelia turned to him sharply, but the damage had been done. Hawthorne nodded. Jonathan Langston was killed because he got too close. And in the end, even loyalty couldn't erase the truth. The room remained silent, save for the distant rumble of thunder. The storm had reached its peak, but within these walls the game was over. A heavy mist clung to the narrow cobblestone streets, swallowing the flickering glow of gas lamps as the night pressed against the Whitmore estate like a silent predator. The air was thick with the weight of unspoken truths, the Grand Manor standing as both witness and accomplice to the secrets it harbored. Inside the dimly lit drawing room, the tension coiled like a snake, waiting to strike. Inspector Alden Graves surveyed the room, his sharp gaze resting on the assembled figures, each one a study in restrained panic. Evelyn Whitmore, draped in widow's black, sat rigidly in the high-backed chair, her pale fingers gripping the armrests as though they alone could keep her tethered to composure. Across from her, Victor Langley adjusted his silk cravat, the gleam of sweat on his temple betraying an otherwise calculated poise. Near the window, Arthur Blackwood nursed a brandy glass, his usual bravado reduced to silence as he stared into the storm raging beyond the glass. And then there was Celeste Harrow, the enigmatic socialite, her ruby lips curved into something resembling amusement, her fingers tracing the rim of her champagne flute. "We all understand why we are here," Graves said, his voice low, deliberate, a blade poised at the throat of deception. Edgar Whitmore did not simply disappear into the night. He was erased. A rustle of movement. Evelyn flinched, Victor's fingers twitched, Arthur exhaled through his nose, and Celeste merely smiled. "You're mistaken," Evelyn whispered, her voice brittle as porcelain. "My husband was about to expose you all," Graves interrupted, stepping forward, "and someone among you ensured that never happened." He paced the length of the room, the firelight casting elongated shadows across the paneled walls. Edgar Whitmore uncovered something, an intricate web of deceit, theft and betrayal. He gathered evidence. He was going to name names, and that, my dear Mrs. Whitmore, is why he had to die. A sharp intake of breath. "That's a rather bold claim, Inspector," Victor said smoothly, though his grip on his glass was just a fraction too tight. "It is," Graves agreed, "but I deal in facts, not speculation, and the facts place each of you in a rather precarious position." He turned sharply, fixing Arthur in his gaze. "You, Mr. Blackwood, have been bleeding Whitmore's finances dry, gambling away assets that were not yours to lose. Edgar found out, didn't he?" Arthur's lips pressed into a thin line. "I had nothing to do with his death." "Perhaps not directly," Graves allowed, "but desperation makes men reckless." He shifted his gaze to Celeste. "And you, Miss Harrow, have spent years playing both sides, selling secrets to the highest bidder, ensuring your survival no matter who fell in your wake." Edgar confronted you, didn't he? Celeste's smile did not falter. A lady never reveals her hand, Inspector. But I will, Graves countered. Because the truth has already spoken for itself. He withdrew a folded letter from his coat. Edgar left behind more than just suspicions. He left behind proof. He wrote down everything, including the name of the person he feared most. The air in the room shifted, a barely perceptible crack in Evelyn's composure, a flicker of something in Victor's otherwise impassive expression, but he never got the chance to send it, Graves continued, voice razor-sharp. Because you stopped him, didn't you, Mrs. Whitmore? The room stilled. Evelyn's breath caught, her knuckles white against the fabric of her gown. Graves took a step forward. He trusted you, Evelyn. He suspected others, but he never thought, not for a moment, that his own wife would be the one to plunge the knife into his back. The silence stretched, suffocating in its weight. Then her shoulders sagged, her lips parted, and in her eyes, Graves saw the truth. The storm outside howled, but within these walls, the final betrayal had already been laid bare. The village of Ravenshire had returned to its usual stillness, but beneath the cobbled streets and behind the hushed whispers of its people, something darker lingered, a stain that no amount of time could truly wash away. The wind carried the scent of rain and damp earth, stirring the old trees that lined the Whitfield estate, their gnarled branches reaching like skeletal fingers toward the bruised sky. Inside the grand drawing room, the embers of the dying fire cast ghostly flickers of light across the polished wooden floor, shadows stretching and retreating, as if the house itself breathed in the aftermath of the night's revelations. Inspector Caldwell sat opposite Margaret Holloway, the woman who had unraveled the tangled web of lies that had ensnared the estate. She appeared calm, her fingers tracing the delicate rim of her untouched teacup, but Caldwell knew better. There was something in her eyes, a knowing, an understanding that went deeper than mere deduction. The storm outside had passed, but its remnants remained, clinging to the edges of the world, like the echoes of a scream in an empty hall. Do you think anyone will remember? Caldwell's voice was quieter now, carrying the weight of the days that had led them here. The question was rhetorical in a way, yet it hung in the air between them, refusing to be dismissed as idle thought. Margaret exhaled softly, setting the cup down with a deliberate clink. Perhaps, she mused, her voice distant, as if speaking less to him, and more to the ghosts that still lingered in the room. But not in the way one might think. People forget details, Inspector. They forget the truths that inconvenience them. But the shadows of what happened here, those will remain. She stood, stretching her stiff limbs, the finality of the night settling into her bones. The rain had stopped, leaving the world outside glistening under the hesitant moonlight. Drops clung to the window pane, refracting the dim glow of the street lamps, distorting reality in shifting patterns. Caldwell studied her for a moment, his keen eyes scanning her expression for something: fatigue, satisfaction, regret. Perhaps all of them. You've earned your rest, he said finally, his voice softer than before. Margaret gave him a small knowing smile. Rest is for those who stop searching, Inspector, and I don't believe I ever will. She turned toward the door, her steps measured and deliberate, as if walking through the threshold of more than just a room, but into something unseen, something waiting. The case was solved, the culprits named, the guilty taken away in the dead of night. But the true crime, the one that wove through every deception, every desperate act of self-preservation, was something much older, much deeper than a single murder. It was the nature of people, of their secrets, their betrayals. It was the kind of crime that could never be arrested, never be tried in a court of law, because it was embedded in the very fabric of human existence. Outside, the village of Ravenshire breathed again. The shutters were drawn, the streets empty, the air thick with the damp scent of fading turmoil. Soon, people would return to their quiet lives, their comfortable routines, their well-kept facades. But Margaret knew better. She had seen what lay beneath. The illusion of normalcy was just that, an illusion, beneath the pleasantries, behind the lace-curtained windows and polite nods exchanged on cobbled streets, there were always secrets, and something in the air told her she would see them again. Perhaps not tomorrow, perhaps not for months. But Ravenshire was never truly at peace, and neither was she. The village of Blackthorn had settled into the illusion of peace, its narrow streets bathed in the silver hush of an autumn moon, but beneath its picturesque calm, an unease still coiled, unseen yet felt, like a whisper through the bones of the town. The estate at Wetherby Hollow stood in solemn silence, its ivy-clad walls seeming to breathe in the night's secrets. Inside, the embers in the grand fireplace cast trembling shadows across the study, where Evelyn Harrow sat, her hands resting lightly on a letter she had yet to open. Inspector Graves stood by the window, his silhouette stark against the rain-dappled glass, the weight of unspoken knowledge pressing between them. "You don't have to read it," he murmured, but they both knew that was a lie. Letters like this were never ignored, only delayed. Evelyn traced the edges of the envelope, her breath shallow. The events of the past week had been neatly wrapped up in the public eye, the guilty condemned, the scandal buried, but the deeper truth, the truth only she and a select few would ever know, had been swallowed into the abyss where such knowledge always went. "They want it forgotten," she said at last, her voice barely above a whisper. "And you?" Graves asked, his gaze still fixed beyond the glass, where the village slept in blissful ignorance. She exhaled slowly, unfolding the letter with deliberate care, her fingers steady though her pulse betrayed her. The words inside were measured, clinical, a thank you, a warning, a veiled command wrapped in polite gratitude. The final line stood out like a blade against the paper. "Some truths must remain buried, Miss Harrow, for the greater good." A bitter smile touched her lips. The greater good. It was always someone else who decided what that meant. Folding the letter, she placed it beside her untouched tea, watching as the steam curled into nothingness. Outside, the first traces of morning bled into the sky, the village stirring once more into the comfortable routine of normalcy. Shopkeepers would open their doors, children would laugh in the streets, and the world would pretend that nothing had ever happened. But Evelyn knew better. The past did not rest, not truly. It lingered in the forgotten corners, in the hush of locked rooms, in the eyes of those who had seen too much. As Graves stepped away from the window, tipping his hat in quiet farewell, she remained seated, her gaze drifting toward the fire. The world would move forward, as it always did, but the cracks were there, waiting, and when the next secret surfaced, because they always did, she would be ready.